Hi, I'm MK and I'm part of the team here at TWCC. We're so excited for our series, Everybody Always. All month long, we're going to tackle the question, how do you find love in a world of hate? Check out this week's message.
We're looking at Everybody Always. So I've been watching the news this past week, and there's this cruise ship floating around out in the ocean, and y'all have heard of the coronavirus, right? Because it's sweeping the world, and a lot of people are dying, and a really big impact over in Southeast Asia. And there's this cruise ship out there. It's Holland Cruise Lines, and they're out there, and they're floating, and they can't dock, right? So I've been kind of watching. It's just intrigued me because nobody will accept them. Like, there's this floating cruise ship, and I know it's a little bit hard to have compassion for people on a cruise ship, right? Because I'm like, if you're going to be stuck on a cruise ship. But they're stuck, and nobody would let them in. They were quarantined on this boat. Here's the crazy thing, is nobody on the boat had it. They came in and they tested, and nobody on the boat had it. But they wouldn't let them in because of the fear of what they would bring into their country. The unclean weren't allowed to get anywhere near the clean. 1,500 people quarantined. 1,500 people with a label that they didn't even have. A passenger they finally got to dock in Cambodia, of all places, one of the poorest nations over there. Kind of a dictator runs it. They were allowed to dock. He met them. He was handing them flowers and all of this stuff. And there was a passenger that got off the boat, and they were interviewing him, and he said, I just wanted to hug my family. He said, I was sitting out there thinking, what's going to happen if nobody lets us in? We're going to run out of food. You're on a boat with 1,500 people in the middle of the ocean. What if we run out of gas? Am I ever going to get to see my family again? In my lifetime, I'm about 43. I know some of you are older than I am, and you can remember more. But in my lifetime, when we start talking about diseases, there was like SARS that came out, and that was kind of the pre-coronavirus, and it was a big scare across. You had SARS, you have influenza, sweeping across, killing thousands and thousands of people. Ebola, you see happening over in Africa and all that, and they quarantine whole villages, and they burn whole villages to keep the unclean from touching the clean. And then in America, one that really swept kind of our country in the 70s and 80s was HIV and AIDS. And you see all these pandemics, and when they come out, we live in a 24-hour news cycle. So as you're in this 24-hour news cycle, you're seeing this stuff. But I think a lot of times, I know for me, like I'm watching this coronavirus and stuff on TV, and I'm just kind of like, it's over there. Right? See, it really doesn't affect me because I live in Northport, Alabama, and the people in China got it, right? So, but I'm watching it, and while I feel bad for them, I'm not directly impacted because it doesn't really affect anybody that I know. And when you see Ebola and you see all these diseases, I think a lot of times in a 24-hour news cycle where we're just constantly bombarded with news, we often get numb to the fact of what the impact of these diseases really are. And I think a lot of times we're kind of like that with the Bible. Is you look at, I'm in Leviticus, and they're talking about leprosy, and there's this disease in the Bible, and if you grew up in church, you heard a lot about it. If you didn't, it's not one that really affects America. It doesn't really affect a lot of people anymore, as far as I know, but it's leprosy, and we read about leprosy in the Bible, and we think, it's kind of just like a skin rash, right? It's like, how bad could leprosy be? We got cures for that, so it's not a big deal. It's something that happened way back then, right? So it doesn't really affect us today. And I'll be honest, I thought that leprosy was just like a really bad skin rash. I thought, it'd kind of get up on you and stuff like that. And it's the first century, so they didn't have the modern medicine that we have today. So I was like, it probably wasn't really that big a deal, but they just didn't have the medicine for it. But what I found out is it wasn't a disease that was just on the outside. Actually, by the time you saw it on the outside, it was already heavily infected into your body, because what leprosy is a disease that affects you from the inside out. It eats up your body from the inside out. It takes over your nervous system. It gets into you, and it starts to creep through to your nervous system to the point where you can't feel anything. You can't feel on the ends of your fingers. You can't feel your feet. You can't feel. And so what often happens is people don't actually die from the leprosy itself. What they die from is the infection, because you'll get a cut, or you'll get a hurt, or you'll hurt yourself and not even feel it. And when you don't feel it, that's when the most dangerous time is. They say somebody with leprosy could literally touch a hot stove with their hand and not even know that it would burn them. The decay, it just started eating you up from the inside. But by the time it got to the outside, it would start decaying. So you'd first kind of lose feeling. And then it would start to be these grayish lesions and this grayish look on your skin. That's what he's talking about. You go to the priest, you get checked out. And so you've got these rashes on you. And these rashes begin, what those rashes really are is it's the disease rotting you from the inside out. And by the time you see it, you're already so heavily infected that it's almost rotted you to the core, as they call it. But what they would do is it would literally rot your fingers off. It would rot your nose off. Y'all are like, man, I'm glad I came this morning. Really uplifting, right? But it would rot you. And they would show pictures. I was going to show a couple of pictures, but I was like, man, y'all ain't ready for that because I wasn't ready for it. I got on Google because Google knows everything, and I started looking up pictures. If you really want to see how bad leprosy truly is, get on Google and look. I wasn't about to show those pictures in here this morning because it's just nasty. And what it is it's just rotting flesh that is falling off. Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he described people with leprosy like this. He said they were walking dead people. And so they should be treated like dead people. And here's the thing about leprosy is it didn't rapidly develop. It wasn't one of these things where you got it and you died quickly. It was a prolonged disease that started and you began to get in pain and you were in so much pain, and then by the time you couldn't feel anything, it was so bad and you were isolated. You were isolated, which I think is honestly the biggest pain of all, right? See, here's the crazy thing about leprosy is you could go to the priest if you started to see that you had these blemishes on your skin. If you went to the priest, it wasn't like a, hey, okay, so you got leprosy, so I need you to go back, I need you to pack, and we're going to put you somewhere. It was like you walked into the priest, and if he designated you unclean, you no longer went back to your family. You didn't get to go hug your spouse goodbye. You didn't get to hug your children one last time. You didn't get to go high five your buddy one last time. It was you went from clean and a normal life and everybody knew you to isolated. And they would put them in these colonies called leper colonies. And I believe that the isolation probably hurt as much, if not more, than the physical pain, because you got to think, I've got my family one day and then boom, gone. Everything I knew, job, career, family, everything gone. And not just gone, but now you are isolated. And you're going into this leper colony, and especially if you're on the front end of the disease, you're walking into a flesh-rotting area. And it stinks. And see, the leprosy, they talk about that you eventually lose your vocal cords. They had this raspy, hoarse voice, and you could identify somebody with leprosy because of how they talked or what they looked like and how unclean that they really were. This morning we're going to look at a story. See, too often our identity can become consumed by our issues. When you look at the Leviticus, you had to walk around. You had to say unclean, unclean. If you walked into anywhere where they had clean people, you had to announce that you were coming, and you were like unclean, unclean. If it was me, I would become unclean. I would no longer be Scott because my identity became my issue. I was unclean. I was a leper, and they dressed you in a way, and they made you look a certain way, and they kept you away because you were unclean, and so your identity became your issue. And I think far too often it looks a lot like we look at this story way back then, but I think when you talk about everybody always love, I think it looks a lot like our culture today, just maybe not as extreme as leprosy, but I think it looks a lot like our culture today in the fact that far too often, especially within churches, we don't want the unclean. And when you go with everybody always kind of stuff, you sit there and you look at what Jesus did and how Jesus loved. Far too often, we're known for our past. We're known for our labels. We're known for our mistakes. We're known for our issues. And I'm just going to tell you this morning, I wanted to kind of demonstrate everybody always loves. So it's probably not going to be this really big, deep, like exegetical, big word kind of message. But what it's going to be is it's going to be kind of showing us what everybody always does. We're going to look at a story about a guy who had leprosy. He was a man who had no name. You see, I think it's ironic that they don't even give this guy a name. He's just the leper. He's just a leper. He's the unclean guy. He doesn't have a name, and he's probably been in this colony a while, and his identity is his name. And his name is unclean. But this is a guy who had no name, who came to the one whose name is above all names. And we're going to look at a story that should rock our socks off when it comes to how the church should love. I'm going to be in Mark chapter 1. Like I said, if you don't have your Bible, we're going to throw it up on the screen for you. Excuse me. A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus begging to be healed. He says, if you're willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Moved with compassion, and we're going to get back to that in a minute. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and he touched him. And he said, I am willing. I think that might be one of the most dynamic statements in the entire gospel. I am willing. Be healed. Instantly, the leprosy disappeared and the man was healed. And Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. Don't tell anybody about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. But the man went out and spread the word. I find this just funny, right? So the guy's got leprosy. He comes and gets healed. And Jesus says, hey, don't go tell anybody. And he goes and tells everybody. But here's what I think. I think when you have a true encounter with the Savior, you can't help but tell everybody. But the man went and he spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. As a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter the town anywhere. He had to stay out in a secluded place. But people from everywhere kept coming to him. We're in a series called Everybody Always. I'm not going to spend a lot of time recapping this morning. You can jump on YouTube. You can look back on our website. You can kind of catch it. But the concept is from a book by a guy by the name of Bob Goff. And I'm not, saying that the book is awesome. We're going to start using it in our Tuesday night small group. And it's the concept. I love the concept. What he's saying is that we can change the world by loving people the way Jesus loved people. How did Jesus love people? He loved everybody. Always. It's a phenomenal concept. And when you think about everybody always, it's kind of like a little cliche-ish. You're like, yeah, of course we're supposed to love everybody always. But then when you start to really dig in and look at how Jesus actually loved people, it changes the perception of what everybody always looks like. We've been using this verse throughout the whole series, and they will know that you follow me. Some of you have a translation that says, and they will know that you're my disciples by how you love one another. It doesn't say they'll know that you follow me by the music you listen to, by the t-shirt that you wear, by the bumper sticker that you slap on the car, by the check that you put in the offering plate. It says they will know that you love me by how you love one another. Week 1, we talked about another. Week 2, we talked about our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? And we talked about forgiving and all of that good stuff and how to even begin to love everybody always. You've got to forgive everybody always, because the Bible actually, when you look at the standard of Jesus, the Bible talks about you will be forgiven the way that you forgive others. So if you're sitting in here this morning and you have unforgiveness in your heart and you ask yourself, have I been forgiven? And you read what the standard was through Jesus, you go, uh-oh. You see, there's no room for interpretation in everybody always. That's what I love about everybody always kind of love is I don't care if you use the NIV, the NLT, the NKJV, the ABCD. I don't care what version you use. Whatever version you use, everybody always means everybody. Say everybody. Always. Say always. You know what that looks like? It looks like the guy who doesn't look like you. It looks like the guy who doesn't dress like you. It looks like the guy who doesn't talk like you. It looks like the guy who's a different color than you. It looks like the guy that votes different than you. It looks like the people who are hard to love. Everybody always. And this week we're going to look at how everybody always love requires amazing grace. Everybody always love requires everybody always grace. And that's another thing that we kind of look at. It's kind of a churchy word. I mean, let's be honest. How many of y'all use the phrase grace this week at work? Man. I was sitting there watching that football game, and we just need to give Saban some grace. You don't say that. Well, I'm going to give the umpire some grace today. It's all about grace, right? We don't talk about grace. We sing songs like Amazing Grace, and I think far too often we get caught up in lights and words and the stuff, and we sing some songs. If you grew up in an old school church, it's an old hymn. It's called Amazing Grace, and for me, it's one of my favorite songs. It reaches deep, but for some people, it's like, oh, that's just one of those old schools, but we'll sing it, right? It's Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. You know, save a wretch like me. That's another word we use a lot, right? Man, I just feel like a wretch today. But we have all these songs. We don't really think about what grace really looks like. And in old Hebrew, grace came from the same spot as passion. It came from the same spot. It meant something huge back then. But I don't believe that the word grace has lost its meaning. Some would say that when you experience grace like the leper did, you can't help but tell everybody. You see, I think to love everybody always, what you often have to do is you've got to accept amazing grace. You've got to have an encounter with Jesus. I don't think you can love everybody always until you felt that everybody always kind of love. When I look at this leper, what I see is this major isolation. He's no longer worthy to be with everybody else, right? He's no longer worthy to have a name. See, back in those days when you really dig into Levitical law, which was the stuff that they wrote, if you read Leviticus, if you're just starting out in church, please don't start in Leviticus. It's like a who's who of diet and a who's who of skin rashes and a who's who of law. But what they do is they made you wear this mask, right? And you had to stay like away from everybody. You ceased to be allowed to be in communion with the people who were considered clean. You actually had to keep 50 feet away, 50 paces away from anybody who was clean. So this week, because this is what I do during the week, I came in and I started counting out, like, what does that look like? Because this morning I want to kind of show you what everybody always loved looks like through the eyes of a leper. And I think this is one that I can relate massively well with, and I'm going to try to tie it in if I do a bad job. So I'm going to ask the camera, and if you're watching online, great. If we mess this all up, it's all cool. So I'm going to be here. Just follow me with the camera. So this morning I was walking, and I was looking at 50 paces, and I started over here on the front row, and Mr. Alga, I'm not going to make you sing or anything like that. I'm just going to start with you. Is that all right? Can I use you for an example? All right. So I started here, and I started counting out. I said, you know, what is 50 paces? Because when you start walking out 50 paces, it actually looks like a really long way. Because 50 paces, you're kind of like, it's just 50 steps, right? Well, I get over here, and I'm about halfway when I get to my buddy Adam here. This is about 25 paces. And I sit there, and I'm looking, and I can actually barely see. Like, this to me is a long way. Like, I think that an unclean person, like, if you're this far away, you'll be all right. Right? So I'm looking at unclean versus clean, and I'm going 50 paces. Like, I have to stay away from anybody who's clean for 50 paces. This is only 25. So I kept counting. So I come back here, and I'll get to why this is a big deal, because like 50 paces, like, see, 50 paces, he doesn't need to smell me. He doesn't need to really see me, because I'm rotting on the inside, and I smell really bad. And like today, I wore an outfit that I smell really bad. Wes, you want to smell me? No, don't do that. So, but this is about 35 paces. So then I kept counting it out, and I'm sitting here thinking, man, I can barely see him now. He's all the way over there. He's all the way over there. And here's the crazy thing about everybody always love. Everybody always love requires intimacy, because when you look at how Jesus touched the leper, he didn't just say, hey, be healed and step way away. He didn't keep 50 paces. Jesus said, the story says Jesus reached out and touched him. There's no way he can touch me from over here. But this isn't even 50 paces. See, 50 paces even goes further back. 50 paces comes all the way back here to the back. And see, here's why this is a big deal to me. I'm up there on the screen. Y'all can look up there and see me. See, this is why this is a big deal to me. Because there was a day. Here's why this story means so much to me. Because there was a day. You see, I hadn't always been a preacher. There was a day that I was the unclean. Still am. It's not as noticeable. But there was a day, see, back in the day, I got out of the military and I went stupid for a while. And there was a day that I wound up, I was in Los Angeles, California. I was working a bar scene. And I started doing drugs. And I know there's some of y'all that you're new here and you're like, one, I can't figure out why in the world he's wearing what he's wearing. And now he's talking about drugs. And I know there's a danger here with being too authentic. But our church, we believe in being authentic. But there was a day when I was in L.A. and I went from L.A. to Laredo because I had a drug problem, and that seemed to make sense, so I went to the Mexican border. And then from there, I went to Austin, and from Austin, I went to Birmingham to Denver. And anyway, long story short, I wound up in Denver, Colorado. And I wound up homeless. I was on Martin Luther King Boulevard, and I was in a park, and I woke up and don't really know how I got there, but I was homeless, right? And see, here's a crazy thing. This is about the outfit I had on. And I know in church you're supposed to look really clean, right? You're supposed to dress up and you're supposed to look really clean. But this is about the outfit I had on. And I remember in a moment of sobriety, and my parents are in this room, and they'll be able to fill in some blanks if you want to know the story. But there was a day that I woke up, and in a moment of sobriety, I staggered around and found a payphone. For some of you young people, you put a coin in it and you push some numbers. You didn't have a phone in your pocket back in those days. But I hit 0 because I didn't have a coin. And I called. And it was late. And I don't even know if my parents knew I was alive. And I remember my dad answered the phone. And I said, I want to come home. And he asked me, he said, can you find a Greyhound? And so I staggered. And here's how I know a little bit about what leprosy feels like. Is I remember walking down Martin Luther King Boulevard, which if you've ever been to Denver, I was in the hood. I was in the bad part of town. It was a rough part of town. You wouldn't be out at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I started walking down the street, and people parted. They went to the other side of the street because I was that guy. I was unclean. Like I didn't have to yell it. I looked it. I had piercings. I was greasy. I was homeless. I was dirty. I looked a lot like what I look like today. And I remember walking down the street, and I walked into the Greyhound, and even on my way to Missouri, I finished up with what was left in my pocket, right? And I remember I got out. I got out of the bus station, and my dad kind of walked by me like he didn't even recognize me. I didn't weigh much. I'd strung out. I was dirty. I was unclean. And I got into their apartment, and my dad introduced me to some people, and I really probably should have remembered what their name was, but I don't. And they were like, hey, we got this church up the road. I'm like, yeah, right. Because, see, I grew up in church, right? I did the Bible drills. I did the RAs. I did the training union. I mean, I can still quote you the first verse I learned in Bible drills. Some of y'all might call them sword drills. Isaiah 48, grass withers, flower fades, word of God, stand forever. I could flip a blue Bible back and forth like nobody's business. I could quote you the quotes. I could say the verses. I could sing the songs. I was even in the choir until they figured out I couldn't carry a tune. Then they gave me all the drama parts. So I knew it. This guy said, he said, why don't you come to church? And I remember laughing. Right? I barely got clothes. Dude, I had piercings, tats, I had scars. I was dirty. I was unclean. Unclean! I was like, all right. So I walked into church, 50 paces, all the way across the room. See, I walked into church, and I sat right back here. It was in the back corner. And see, I didn't have a veil on in church. What I had is I had on a ball cap. And see, this is going to make some of y'all twitch. Because I had a ball cap on, and it wasn't a veil, but it was a cap, and I kept my cap tucked way over my eyes because you can't see me. Because if you knew what I had done, if you knew the people I had hurt, if you knew the immoral things I had done, see, you're going to look at me, and I'm unclean. And I walked into this church as a leper. And I walked in. And see, everybody always loves requires proximity. It requires, to love somebody, you have to be near them, right? And it's easy to say I love somebody when I'm this far away. But everybody always loves requires you to be this close. And see, I remember I was sitting in that back row, and I had my hat down. And I was in the back corner, and my parents were sitting up ahead because I didn't want to embarrass them. And so I'm sitting back there, and I remember this guy coming up, and he said, "Hey, man." He sat down with me. And I thought, maybe there is a place I can get better. Maybe there is a place. You see, I kept going. Because that first step, when I think about the leper, I think about the fact that there was a day that he could no longer hug his wife. There was a day that he could no longer hug his kids. There was a day when he got isolated. There was a day when he wasn't worthy anymore. And I look back and I think, man, if God hadn't placed, because there was a day in my life when I wasn't the wanted one because I should have been aborted and I wasn't. I was a rape baby and all this stuff. But God intersected an amazing couple that became mom and dad. And at my lowest point, when I was the most unclean, they picked up a phone. And I think about this leper, and I go, if it requires proximity, what it would have looked like, it felt like, to the leper coming to Jesus. Like, first off, where was Peter? This is a guy that cut off somebody's head. Or tried to, he missed. And he cut off an ear. It was Peter's job to protect Jesus. So where was Peter during all this? Here's a guy who's going to walk up to his Savior, to everything that he believes in, everything he hopes in. This is a guy, he's an unclean guy. He could have screwed up the whole thing. Because if this guy touches Jesus, right, the unclean touches the clean, it becomes unclean. He could have messed up the whole ministry. Where were the boys at? So this leper walks in. And he had to have gotten to a place. I don't know the guy. He doesn't have a name. I don't know his personality. But he had to have reached a point when he said, I don't want to live this way anymore. And there was a point. Because in Levitical law, he could have been killed immediately for being there. Much less walking up without screaming unclean. What that first step must have been like. Taking that first step going, I could die. But here's the truth of it. I would rather die trying to get better than to live in isolation and to be eaten up from the inside out anymore. And that first step had to be the hardest one. It's kind of like walking into church when you're dirty. It's kind of like walking into church when you don't have the right clothes to wear. It's kind of like walking into church when you got grease all over you. It's kind of like walking into church when you got a ball cap on. It's kind of like walking into church when you know everybody's staring at you because your reputation is so bad. It's kind of like walking into church and you feel like everybody's staring at you because you got tattoos. It's kind of like walking into church when you feel like everybody's whispering about you because you don't know the songs and you don't know the verses and you don't even know where the book of Mark is, and you're sitting there and you feel absolutely isolated and you think everybody's whispering and you think everybody's looking because you are unclean. That first step's hard. But then the second step, I have to think that he was thinking, well, the first step, nobody stopped me. So the second step, and then the third step, then the 20th step, and then the 25th step. See, he got to a place where he was halfway. He got to a place where when the distance back to where he was and the distance to where he wanted to be, it would have been easy to stay back here because I know this, and while I'm going to die, it's safe, and there's other people like me. But this over here, if this guy is who he says he is, I can hug my child again. If this guy is who he says he is, I can repair my relationship with my wife. If this guy is who he says he is, I don't have to walk in shame anymore, because this was a walk of shame. Because here's the deal. Everybody parted. Everybody was staring at him. Everybody was going, oh my gosh, the unclean. 24, 23. His boys haven't stopped me yet. 22, 21. And he gets to the place. And here's what I think. I don't think he walked up to Jesus and said, hey, bro, I think you can heal me. I think that as he got closer to Jesus, because when you read the passage, the passage says he fell to his knees. I have a feeling that he was walking with his head down. I have a feeling that he was walking with his hat over his eyes. Because he couldn't look at the Savior because he was unclean. And he had been told he was unclean. And he had been given a label. He had been given the addict label. He had been given the shame label. He had been given the unwanted label. He had been given the mess up label. He had been given the screw up label. He had been given the label. And he didn't want to look at this guy, but he knew that this guy could change it. And he got to him. And there was a place when he got to him, it didn't say he looked at him. He didn't say, you know what it says he did? It says he fell straight to his knees. And he looked up. And you know what he found? Found the Savior. See, everybody always love begins with a step. And it ends with the Savior. You see, I got to think that leper thought, man, it just can't. God, I'm sorry. But if you'll just... I don't even have to have a title. If you'll just make me clean, I'll try. And he's got to think that life will never be the same again. And then not only did he heal him, but then he brought people into his life. That he didn't deserve. And the people parted. And nobody interfered. And he met a Savior. He met a Savior. Gene, come up. When you talk about amazing grace, and you look at it through the eyes of a leper, when you talk about amazing grace and you look at it through the eyes of an unclean person, when you talk about amazing grace and you look at it through the eyes of, I deserve what I probably got, it looks different. You see, everybody always loves, when you look at amazing grace, it looks different when you're the leper. And I know that there's people in here and you've done it right your whole life, and I'm proud of you. And my wife is one of those. She's done it right, and God brought her into my life, and he gave me a second chance, and I've got amazing kids. And amazing grace to me is every morning that I get to pack a lunch. Amazing grace to me is every morning I get to look at my wife. Amazing grace is I get to swing a golf club with my dad or have lunch with my mom. And I deserve to be in the leper colony because the choices I made put me there. But God loved everybody always, and he sent a son. And he parted people. And he brought people in, and the things that should have happened didn't, and the things that could have happened didn't. And what I ended up finding was the Savior. And here's the deal. I know there's some of you in here this morning. God, you've got something in your past. Pick a spot. There's some blanks on your worship guide. And you would say, I've been hiding behind a veil for so long, like I can't imagine anybody ever finding that out. Everybody always. You see, what I love about this story is the leper cried out to Jesus, heal me, if you're willing. And he said, of course, I'm willing. When you look at it today, he had an encounter actually with Jesus. What does that look like today? Heal me, God, I already did. I already died for you. You see, back then he reached out and he touched it. He touched it. See, he didn't talk about everybody always love. He reached out and he touched it. And there's a Greek word. And if you got an NIV or you got an NLT, there's a word in there and it gets interpreted different. 1984 in the NIV, it looks different. And in my NLT, it says compassion. But it also has been interpreted as indignant. And so which is it? Was Jesus compassionate or was he indignant? And I think the answer to that is yes, because he was compassionate and he wanted to heal the guy, because the guy, the steps he had to take to get in front of Jesus, he was compassionate. But I also think he was a little bit indignant, because I think that he saw the shame on this guy. And I think he saw the way that people like moved away from him. And I think he saw the hurt and the pain. And he felt. And it just rose up from a spot deep within him. And he said, this is why I came. And I think when we look at the church and you look at everybody always love, this is why we're here. Jesus says, I came to seek and save those who are lost. When you look at the story of the leper, here's the crazy thing. Even if you did it all right, the crazy thing is we all have spots. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. Nobody's righteous, no, not one. We're all the leper. And there was a day when we took a step. And there was a day when somebody introduced us to the Savior. So I have a challenge for us as a church. When you look at everybody always loved through the eyes of Jesus, man, it's a standard. But when you look at everybody always loved through the eyes of the leper, it changes the perspective. See, I even watched this morning when I come in and this. Some of you aren't shocked. You'd be more shocked if I had a suit on. But I even saw some looks. It's kind of like, and here's the truth of it. There are people that walk through those doors every Sunday. They may be dressed up, but on the inside they're rotting. On the inside they've got shame. On the inside they've got hurt. On the inside they've got pain. On the inside they've got a marriage they're worried they're not going to be able to salvage. On the inside they've got kids that they don't talk to anymore. On the inside they're isolated. And the first step, because I measured out 50 paces, it's halfway across that parking lot. And there was somebody in here this morning that was sitting in their car going, I don't want to take a step. Because they're going to look at me, they're going to stare at me, I'm unclean. Everybody always love. You see, you can't have everybody always love until you feel everybody always love. So I want you to think back for that moment when you were the leper. And then I want you to look at people differently. As a church, my prayer is that God brings us the lepers. All of them. The ones that don't dress like us. The ones that don't talk like us. The ones that have a ball cap pulled really low. Because I don't want you to see. God, this morning, there's somebody in here that needed to hear this story. I don't know that it was for everybody, but I know that it was for somebody. Because there was a day when I needed to hear this story. Everybody always is the love of a father that answers the phone. Everybody always is you. God, hear our cry this morning. If there's somebody in this room today that feels like they don't belong, if there's somebody in this room today that feels like they're unclean, God, let them know how much you love them. And God, as a church, I pray from the bottom of my heart, God, send us the lepers. Send us the dirty, send us the broken, send us the messy. Send us the unclean, and here's why. Because we are all the leper. And rather than stare and look and whisper in the corner, God, I pray that you break our hearts. God, I pray that you break our hearts for the people who break yours. God, I pray that you break our hearts for the young lady walking out of that abortion clinic. God, I pray that you break our hearts for the homeless. God, I pray that you break our hearts for those staggering in with broken marriages. with broken hearts, with shame, with the past, with regret. God, break our heart for who breaks yours. God, on that cross, your heart broke. And it broke for the leper. You didn't say love everybody always. You showed us. God, we're on our knees, crying out to you. Make us the vessel. God, press us, crush us. God, bring them to us. And allow us to love people the way that you love people. In Jesus' name.
If this message had an impact on you, we would love to hear about it. You can email us at yourstory@twccalabama.com. If you'd like to give to our online campus, you can click the Give link in the description. And don't forget to hit that red subscribe button to keep up to date on the things we're doing. Check us out next week as we continue Everybody Always.